Well, Jemima Oakey, welcome to BRI Dialogues. It's a great pleasure to have you with us. And before kicking off, I like to share your background and your accomplishments with our audience. Of course, you're a research fellow at the Carboun Institute and you head the China-MENA program, which analyzes the cooperation between China and the Middle East on renewable energy projects and climate collaboration. Very timely, of course, in conditions that we live, particularly in a post Davos 2026. Previously, you have been a consultant to the Water, Food, Energy Nexus of Government, Research Institute, and NGOs, and you have an extensive experience in traveling across the Middle East with stakeholders, meeting them, understanding, and having your hand on the pulse of everything renewable, everything China, everything Middle East. So we're delighted to have you with us. And before we get into questions, why don't you better introduce what Carboun does and where it was originated so that we set the tone for the next of our conversation. And I'll come back to the question before Anush jumps in.
Of course. Well, thank you very much both for having me. It's a pleasure to be a part of the BRI Dialogues. For a bit of context about the Carboun Institute, we are a Dutch registered think tank and independent Middle Eastern climate think tank. And we started in April 2025. So we're relatively new, but ready to make a big impact in advancing the Middle East's sustainable development in the age of climate change.
Fantastic. Now, a few years ago, just in the midst of COVID, I was on a public call with nobody other than David Miliband and Patrick Sorio, who was the CEO of AstraZeneca. And in that day, something came to me, and I said, gentlemen, would you agree that we are in the age of diplomacy, in a state of mess rather than diplomacy? Are we in a climate diplomacy as well at the moment, with the United States retrenching from all of the treaties? And does this provide and open a new space for the Middle East or West Asia and China to fill that vacuum?
Certainly, that's a one way to put it. In terms of climate messy, the US's announcement earlier this year to withdraw from 66 treaties, including a number of climate treaties and a number of international organizations that conduct world-leading research that informs governments' decisions on how to adapt and mitigate climate change was disappointing, but unfortunately, with the Trump administration, unsurprising. What this has led to is a funding gap for many of these institutes, such as the IPCC, the UNFCCC, and institutes like IRENA. But when you actually look at the data, this is not funding a funding deficit that the EU would not be able to cover. And certainly that China or the Middle East, particularly Gulf states, would not be able to cover. So, in terms of the financial deficit left for climate funding and the financing of these institutions, I'd say that is not a massive challenge to overcome, particularly if these countries were to coordinate the financing together. The decision on whether this is met will obviously be subject to the political will and political climate of individual states. What is lacking, though, is that leadership from the US, not necessarily that other states are unable to lead, but it's self-harm for the US that they are now excluding themselves from conversations which future administrations may be party to. And this is an opportunity for particularly Middle Eastern states to really join and be part of the conversation to shape the narrative. The Middle East is one of the worst affected places on the planet for climate change. We've seen huge heat waves, consecutive days of more than 45 degrees, going up to 51 degrees, particularly during the Hajj in Mecca last year. And there were 1,300 deaths of different of pilgrims across
Mm.
the Hajj period, and a lot of that can be attributed to heat wave
Yeah.
related illnesses. And so, for a region that is so adversely affected, I've only named one symptom of climate change, the heat waves. There are so many other challenges that are impacting the Middle East as a result of this. This is an opportunity for Middle Eastern states to step up and actively engage and shape the conversations, and the more that the Middle East is able to do that, the more the financing can also then go to adaptation and mitigation strategies in the region.
Uh, Lovely, Jemima. One question on the theme of America and one on the theme of the Gulf Arab states. I, in previous discussions Alan and I've had with our guests, we last year we spent a year before that actually quite a bit of time talking about President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act and how he was trying to regroup technology, modern technology, new technologies around climate change and to concentrate them in the United States. And, we talked to Europeans who were very worried about the impact of that on long-term investments in Europe. Under Trump, of course, that is all ancient history. He's got absolutely no interest. People say, well, at the state level, the Americans are doing this. But actually, I think it has to be at the federal level for it to make major impact. Given that America is now going backwards, and given that, as you rightly say, they're now withdrawing from all these collaborative institutions and research projects, looking forward 5 years' time, say, do you see a massive gap between where China is taking us and where America is going to be? How the Americans going to cope with this? Because the old technologies, I assume, are going to become extremely expensive compared to the new technologies that China is bringing to the table. I'll leave that one first, then I'll tell you my second one.
Sure. So the if we break this question down, I think the issue about technologies, particularly for renewable energy, China at the moment is the world
Right.
leader, particularly for solar energy,
Right.
particularly for battery development, not only in its production, but in the development of new batteries. And that in itself will define what minerals are required for batteries and what minerals are deemed critical by different international organizations. So China is really leading the discussion, the development, and the manufacture of global renewable energy technologies. In terms of concentrating these in the US, the new administration has offered little incentive
Mhm.
for renewable energy uh, technology production,
Mhm.
and therefore, that is going to be a lag. What, particularly for 5 years' time, for a future administration, what might be a difference is the US has particularly stepped up its goal to increase its mining operations and refining operations of critical minerals. In terms of the refining capabilities, at the Future Minerals Forum in Saudi Arabia earlier this month, there was a lot of very exciting talk about new renewable energy technologies in refining capability, in refining production in the US. And that is an optimistic step, and certainly the renewable energy will benefit from that if there is greater refining being conducted via renewable energy tech. But for the US to be competitively doing this against China, against other countries, that there's a huge time gap between that and a financing gap. And the long and short of it is China is willing to sell at cheaper rates than other states may be willing to. So that is where there is a market competitiveness for China in the renewable energy technologies. They also have the world leading expertise on this, and that is leading the research on this as well. So for other states, either the EU or the US, to catch up would require significant investment and political will.
Yeah, I'm with you absolutely. In your answer, you mentioned Saudi Arabia, so that relates to the second question, Saudi Arabia and its neighbors. Um, Many were struck that at COP30, under pressure from the oil exporters, they dropped any reference to hydrocarbons reduction. Um, Leaving that aside for a minute, how do you think these countries are going to square the circle of continuing demand for hydrocarbons and the desperate need to diversify and move away from hydrocarbons? Because so long as the demand remains as high as it does, and the Americans now plying into this field themselves as well, what chance do they have to wean themselves off this uh, damaging resource that they've got and be able to maintain the same standard of living and ambition without oil and gas? What do you think?
So that's a very good question, and it would be a lie to say it wasn't a dilemma for Middle Eastern states going forward, particularly hydrocarbon producing states. The biggest challenge I would say is that, yes, as you've rightly said, the hydrocarbons on which many of these economies depend are the ones causing the climate damage. And so trying to reconcile economic stability and the socioeconomic and political stability that that entails with adapting to extreme temperatures, with preventing them escalating further, preventing warming above 1.5 degrees is a major challenge. What a number of Middle Eastern states have done, particularly Gulf states, is announced extremely ambitious renewable energy targets and goals for economic diversification. So, if we look at Saudi Arabia, for example, they're looking to diversify their economy and increase non-oil exports by 200 to 240 billion by 2035. That's a huge increase from where it is now at around 30 to 40 billion. So this level of political will and investment in diversifying economies away from oil is a very promising sign that these states recognize the situation they're in and are making concerted policy efforts to diversify away. Now, in terms of the domestic shift for energy away from hydrocarbons, this is something that is a realistic ambition for many Gulf states and with suitable climate finance for less economically well-off Middle Eastern states that lack the capital that other Gulf states may have. So here there's an opportunity due to the extremely low price of solar and wind technology. It's gone down in some cases by 70% over the past 15 years to $0.02 per kilowatt hour for solar and $0.03 dollars per kilowatt hour for wind. That is vastly cheaper than fossil fuels, and therefore it makes economic sense as well as climate sense to have that as the dominant energy energy mix. So I'd say the market conditions in the Gulf make that an inevitability that the majority of the Gulfs and and the rest of the Middle East will have that in their energy mix going forward. The challenge here, though, is, as you rightly said, the exports. Hydrocarbon exports are really key part of many Middle Eastern states' economies, and there is the challenge of maintaining the standard of living. This is where new technologies such as green hydrogen offer a real opportunity for Middle Eastern states to maintain their role as regional and global energy exporters whilst maintaining economic stability. It's an emerging technology, but the most exciting part is that in what is anticipated in China's new 5-year economic plan is a huge focus on green energy development over the next 5 years from China and the development of this technology going forward. And what we've seen in the past few years is a real drive between China and the Middle East to cooperate on energy issues. And going forward, China has already made substantial investments in Middle Eastern states to make green hydrogen a possibility. So in 2023, there was about $6.7 billion of investment from China into Egypt for green hydrogen and ammonia production. So already the ball is rolling with green hydrogen. The biggest challenge for whether the Gulf states and the rest of the Middle East can be competitive hydrogen exporters will depend very much on lowering the cost of shipping and exporting green hydrogen, and also on ensuring that there are reliable offtakes so that there is actually somewhere to send this. So ensuring those will really help advance the market. But as China continues to grow and develop the feasibility and success of green hydrogen, in the meantime, this is what Gulf states can be focusing on.
Jemima, I want to go back to where you touched on a few minutes ago, which was the rising urban temperatures of 51 Celsius in the southern part of the Persian Gulf, and even on the other side of the Persian Gulf. The question I have is that are we seeing trilateral movement in which China is heavily investing in green and renewable? Yet, as Anush said, the GCC states depend on their oil and gas revenues for a foreseeable future for their social contracts. Yet in the mix, you have to add all of the commitment to AI and artificial intelligence and the data centers that the GCC has promised to America. So on one side, Chinese are coming and saying, oh, let me light and provide, your electricity consumption through renewables for Medina and Mecca and Abu Dhabi. Sell me your oil and gas because I need it back home. And Americans are saying, we will put our digital AI data center embassies as such, and you power it by your oil and gas, you emit. And yes, it's going to be tough, 52 Celsius, but it's not in, LA or in San Francisco. Is there a play in that context, in your opinion?
That's an interesting question. And I understand why you've asked it. Certainly it could look as if that's a deliberate trade-off. But I think it's a bit more nuanced than that. The 51 degrees temperatures for anywhere of upwards of 2 weeks at a time. I think in the UAE last year they had 14 days where the temperatures exceeded 45 degrees Celsius. And because of the humidity levels as well of upwards of 60%, huge risks of wet bulb events which pose serious threats to human life. So I don't think any government in the Middle East is willing to accept that as a trade-off for continuing oil exports because it's too dangerous. In terms of the
I
hydrogen.
want to jump in because I don't want to waste your intellectual capital and wisdom here. But they have promised these AI data centers, So I'm not saying that it's easy, and as you rightly said, these temperatures are going up. But is there a similar assumption like NEOM and the line that yes, we will put all of these data centers? Is there a correlation between some of these ambitions and the realities of nature? That is my question. I'm not saying that it's any society can manage like that, but is there a stretch in imagination and ambition and the climate realities?
Thank you for clarifying the question. In terms of the feasibility of having huge data centers in the Middle East, these do represent a significant increase in energy consumption. So there are some that, could take up to 3 gigawatts of energy. If these are being powered by renewable energy, and as I've said, the costs in the Middle East now are extremely low for renewable energy technology. Therefore, that could offset the energy challenge and energy consumption risks, particularly if these are done in microgrids as well, so they're not causing any difficulties for the wider network. The biggest challenge, honestly, for data centers is water, is ensuring that you have enough water for the cooling of the centers and that this water is managed in a sustainable way. There are methods to achieve this. I'm not party to the exact technical specifics, but there are methods where you can sustainably manage the water consumption. But there needs to be serious discussions and the involvement of local communities as well. Where is this water going to come from? Is this going to be desalinated water? If so, that immediately represents a very high cost and an environmental cost as well because of the brine discharge. So it presents a risk to marine life. An additional issue is, are you going to get this from groundwater then? If so, how are you going to replenish the aquifer? How are you going to prevent saline intrusion? These are all questions that can be answered through sustainable management and the use of technologies and putting these in places where the demand can be managed well. It's a case of careful planning and careful consideration of environmental costs.
Uh, Wonderful. I mean, your technical knowledge, Jemima, is absolutely extraordinary. I'm learning a huge amount uh, from you. I I was struck by what you were saying about green hydrogen and China's leading role in that. We hear much less about that in Europe. Here we are focusing on solar and wind, as you rightly know, and also cellular nuclear, where in America they're already beginning to think about or argue that having these um, small single unit nuclear power plants, which are expensive but also generate a lot of stuff we don't know what to do with. Do you think green hydrogen is something over which EU or European countries, including Britain and China, can converge and have a greater discussions about climate change? Or is that something that the Chinese are much more keen in sharing with the global South and not the global North? What is China doing with this amazing leap that he's got?
So, in terms of green hydrogen, there's no deliberate direction, I would say, in terms of policy or political determination of where green hydrogen will be produced and sent. I'd say the biggest determining factor, though, is the cost of production. So, as I mentioned earlier, the low cost of solar and wind in the Middle East means that it's very easy to and the low cost and high availability of land as well, particularly in countries like Saudi Arabia, like Iraq, like Egypt. There are huge opportunities to have huge solar and wind farms that then have the excess use for green hydrogen production. What is missing in Europe is the low cost of land, and the renewable energy costs are low, but they are not as low as the Gulf. So this is why the Middle East is suddenly becoming such a huge regional player for green hydrogen production and has the opportunity both because of its renewable energy production capacity, but also its location as a export hub to really dominate the green hydrogen story. It's not to say that Europe shouldn't pursue green hydrogen, but it is a case of are the costs feasible and is there land accessibility for this as well for the additional expansion of renewable energy.
Right. Uh, uh, for ignorant person like me, could you also tell us how green hydrogen is packaged for export? What are technologies involved, for example, for pipelining it, shipping it, air freighting it? I don't know how it goes. How how how, how does that work, Jemima?
Jemima,
Okay.
before you answer that, Anush, when he was asking you the previous question, he was talking about small
Yeah.
modular reactors, and he said cellular. And I was
Well,
like, my God, we have registered on BRI a new innovation. So,
absolutely. Cellular is the next step, Ali.
so
Well, we are stretching my engineering knowledge of green hydrogen shipping. I'll confess I might be a bit limited as to the information I can provide on this. But in terms of the basics, you can put it on shipping containers and you can pipe it. The challenges come with actually the amount of density you're able to get compared to liquefied natural gas. And this is where it then becomes better to export green hydrogen as ammonia rather than as green hydrogen itself. The other problem is that the pipelines are more expensive per kilometre and significantly so at the moment. But as I mentioned earlier, this is now an engineering and technological challenge. And many states in the Middle East with high capital and the engineering expertise from the oil and gas industry can use this expertise and can use this capital to look at ways to reduce the shipping and pipeline costs, especially as China unveils its new 5-year plan and as the cost of this technology decreases over time with the economies of scale. So over the next few years, this is a real opportunity for Middle Eastern states to start conducting the R&D and really investing in looking at how this can be reduced so that the cost is acceptable to European markets, for example.
Jemima, there is a widening gap, particularly with the Trump administration, as you so eloquently elaborated on. And the head start that China has in renewables is undeniable. I mean, as much as President Trump talks about the minerals on Greenland, good luck by, extracting and processing and all of that, putting all of those sound bites aside. But the centricity of China in renewables is becoming cemented, particularly because of those behaviors and retrenchments. Is there a possibility, some of it in altruistic way, because the GCC nations and oil producing countries has always been the black sheep of climate crisis? Is there a possibility of a green OPEC as such, an organization that China would be the, a key driver of innovation, R&D, and hardware, and then the capital, as you rightly said, and then engineering, and then a sense of, hey, we're not just oil and gas producers, we are also a key member, founding member of, the Green OPEC. Is that something that is in the cards, or you hear it when you go to such events like the one you attended last month in Saudi Arabia?
A green OPEC would be extremely exciting development, and certainly a development that many states might not have expected if you told them that 20 years ago, perhaps. Whether it's feasible going forward, I'm not sure if that would be something that would be done or explored. But what we're certainly seeing is a lot of cooperation, not only on renewable energy projects, but also on high strategic political levels between China and the Middle East. So there are now 5 or 6, forgive me, I forget the exact number, but dialogue members of Middle Eastern states for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And at their last meeting in September 2025, there was the announcement of new environmental organizations within the SCO. So this is certainly not necessarily a green OPEC by any means at all, but an institutionalizing of ties between the Middle East and China, and particularly the news on cooperation on environmental issues at such high strategic political levels and organizations like this, I'd say is a welcome development, and certainly one that we may see grow in future.
As Ali was speaking, Jemima, I was thinking maybe China needs to start another one and call it Global Green Initiative alongside its Global Civilization Initiative and such like, because they have the branding, so they could do this. Let me take you slightly outside of your comfort zone a little bit in terms of your expertise, the areas that you focused on, and turn to another super economy, a giant state, which is waking up but is being shaken about by China, by United States, less so by Russia, and now EU is embracing it, and that is India. India doesn't seem to get much of a mention in these realms. We know that it's a high-tech economy. We know that on AI they're making progress, and that actually, if the American companies wanted to move out of China, they can relocate to India and such like. Uh, How do you think China's relations with the United States and with India's traditional partners in the Gulf, like UAE, like Oman, like Qatar, like Iran, even for that matter, and Saudi Arabia, is affecting these interactions? And do you rate India as an aspiring, not necessarily emerging, green actor or not? Because it's very hard to tell from where we are sitting.
So that's a really good question, and I completely understand why you've asked it. India is often overlooked in terms of the green energy space. I'll confess that my expertise is predominantly on China and the Middle East, so I wouldn't be able to give the question the answer it deserves. But certainly, we've seen in the last year that Middle Eastern states, particularly Gulf states, level of trade with Asia has expanded significantly and is now more than double its trade with the West. So there is definitely a shift from Middle Eastern states and particularly Gulf states towards Asia as an economic partner. And as India's green energy ambitions grow, then certainly they can. I would expect them to have greater partnerships with Gulf states over the sharing of technologies as well.
Jemima, is there not a possibility, but ever more growing chance that when it comes to the future standards in Middle East, in Africa, West Asia, and the rest of the world, China will be the dominant setting entity for the new standards in and around renewables, particularly with this ebb and flow of West. I mean, Europe as well is now changing all of the deadlines for combustion engines. Oil and gas again is back, and not only to please President Trump, but as well, realities are dictating in Europe as well. But is this an opportunity as well for China to not to dictate, but to cement the standards that China has in renewables for decades, if not centuries to come?
Can I just ask a clarifying question about what you mean by standards?
Standards basically meaning that, the historical, if you look at the world of finance, the financial grid has been set up by United States through SWIFT, the banking regulations, the whole, huh? Oil and gas to a great extent as well has been, by the big BPs, Shells, Exxon Mobils of the world. So as an industry, or IT is debatable. It's, with the arrival and emergence of DeepSeek and others. But in renewables, it's China, as you rightly said, that dominates the upstream, midstream, and downstream, and has now the ambitions of bringing the cost of all of these new renewable sources of energy down, but as well the capacity, the bandwidth to go and roll out. So once you roll out the technology that is coming out of China, you dictate the grid as well in microgrids in other cities. Like you look at Indonesia and Malaysia, some of the island nations. So is there a possibility that the foundation, like the tech stacks that United States dominates with Oracle and cloud, the future renewable stacks will be Chinese? Does that help?
Yes, so I understand. Yeah, the I'd say it's difficult to determine that, it's a multi-million dollar question, but certainly with the trajectory we're seeing at the moment, uh, there is yet to be a competitor that is able to produce solar panels and wind turbines at the cost that China is able to. So um, if states and the EU and other nations continue to um, buy from China, then yes, China will be the dominant leader for this. In terms of whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I think it very much depends on uh, how the renewable energy transition, whether people want to invest in the renewable energy transition and whether they want to be adopting renewable energy quickly or slowly. And I think this is an opportunity for states to really develop uh, quickly with China, because the US is not going to be a competitive alternative source for the foreseeable future, unfortunately.
That's a very diplomatic answer to say yes, but thank you for that.
Uh, uh, Jemima, we are taking you all over the place. So let me extend that metaphor a bit further. And I want to do this because I really want to praise Prime Minister Carney on the record. I thought his Davos speech was not just heroic but intellectually profound, and to get a standing ovation was a real credit to Canada's standing in the world. And he talked about middle powers and about the need for them to mobilize and such like. I see Canada finding itself in the same squeezed space as the Gulf Arab countries find themselves in. That they have America breathing with them, over them, alongside them, and yet they know they need China at the same time. Uh, how do you think the leaders sitting in the hall in Davos would have received Carney's message of a coalition of emerging middle powers in this struggle that is squeezing them through no fault of their own?
So certainly the Middle East, as you've rightly said, is in a challenging position at the moment because of US-China competition. And increasingly, we've seen conditionalities put on a number of states for whether they're cooperating with China or engaging with China, even over technology or economic issues or renewable energy, and then also trying to maintain close partnership with the US as its primary security guarantor, particularly for Gulf states. So it is a balancing act, and certainly, Middle Eastern states have agency and they have their own agendas as well. They are not vassal states by any means of the US or of China, but certainly going forward over the next 4 years or so, and as the Trump administration continues, how to navigate the challenges between balancing engagement with both the US and China. It is difficult. And I think what happened to India with the 50% tariffs that Trump put on them after they announced closer engagements with China, I think that was concerning and certainly not a wake up call, but a warning to states that punitive tariffs can be used. Whether we're going to see Trump do that in future is anyone's guess. Predictability is unfortunately the new norm and the one thing you can rely on in US foreign policy. But in terms of how Middle Eastern states might go about balancing this, I don't think we'll see the tariffs that were imposed on India be imposed on Middle Eastern states. But certainly they're not going to reject China or the US in favor of another. That simply doesn't make sense for Middle Eastern states to reject a long-standing relationship with a security guarantor, which, yes, is strained now, but it's one administration. And so there has to be a long-term view. How are they going to cooperate with the US long-term? What about future administrations? And also any attempt by the US to try and get the Middle East to digress away from a major trading partner, forget hydrocarbons, forget renewable energy. In 2023 alone, there was almost $300 billion worth of trade between Gulf states and China alone. You're not going to sever a relationship like that overnight. And so these are entrenched relationships. It's going to be very much a state of playing the long game, and in the meantime, balancing those acts and striking a delicate balance between both partners.
Jemima, we're getting close to that time that I have to ask our standard question from our guests, but I normally couple that with one last burning question. Based on your experience and observation and this passion for diversification, do you see the Middle Eastern oil and gas rich capitals from Abu Dhabi to, Riyadh, from, Kuwait to Doha, are they tying growingly their collaboration with China in the field of renewables to local investment and local manufacturing on the ground, or no, that is not the localization in the cards? And my wrap up question for all of our sessions is that, as somebody who is so familiar with the trajectory of China, and particularly through the optics of West Asia, I don't call it anymore Middle East, it gives me goosebumps, Middle East. It's associated with all the bad things, sadly. Through the collaboration with West Asia, what would be Jemima's suggestion, advice, and words of wisdom to cinephobes and cinephiles? If you were to leave each party with one piece of advice, what would that be? And the localization question.
Thank you. Sorry, I was just taking notes to break down each of those questions. So I think the question on localization, certainly that is becoming increasingly frequent, as we're seeing with the different renewable energy projects that are happening in the Middle East. And I think it is a positive step forward, certainly for Middle Eastern states, because of the opportunities it provides for tackling youth skills development and youth unemployment, and bringing new skills to the region, especially as we've discussed, if the region's going to increasingly become this major renewable energy exporter in the ideal scenario going forward, then this is only a beneficial opportunity. Whether all of the contracts are going to be determined by that is between different governments and different companies, and whether it works for that particular project. I'd say for now it's quite project specific, but certainly it seems to be an expanding development, and certainly one to watch going forward on whether it expands further. In terms of China exporting its skills and expertise, it's a good and positive step for increasing the level of trust between its partners and increasing China's perception of reliability amongst its partners as well. And that is a card that it's been able to use and play very effectively so far. In terms of your final question about advice I would give to xenophobes and the opposite as well, then is specifically for renewable energy and cooperation between China and the Middle East. I would say that cooperation on renewable energy, we are at a stage now where global warming is threatening to exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius. 2030 is less than 4 years away, and that was when we said we would know for sure if this was no longer possible. The CO2 emissions since the Paris Agreement have continued to go up, and whilst they may have slowed, both because of COVID and also because of greater renewable energy adoption, energy consumption is continuing to increase because of unstable weather conditions such as heat waves, which in 2024 the IEA estimated caused energy consumption globally to increase by 5% because of prolonged heat waves. Climate change and its impacts are happening now, and they are increasing in severity and frequency. And in a piece we recently released at Carboun Institute, we made very clear the impacts that this is happening on the US, and why leaving these treaties is so harmful, not only to its own climate stability, but also to its economy because of the devastating toll of these economic impacts. So the reality is China is the predominant renewable energy exporter in the world. We're going to have some level of cooperation on this. In terms of the geopolitical tensions that remain, particularly in the West, maybe about some anxieties around this, it's always difficult if your supply chain is predominantly from one location, and therefore there is an opportunity for greater diversification of manufacturing in Europe. There would have been in the US, but again, we've discussed that at length. There is an opportunity then for collaboration, but then also how do we manage that going forward? How do we encourage dialogue, and how do we encourage and refoster trust. And that's something that both sides will have to play. And certainly that China would be able to work on increasing the level of trust that it has with European neighbours going forward, so that the renewable energy transition can continue and accelerate at pace in order to tackle the huge challenges we're facing going forward.
So from renewable energy to renewing trust.
Yes.
Yeah. Absolutely brilliant, Jemima. Apart from my revelation that we're on the cusp of developing cellular uh, nuclear power, uh,
Huge development.
your educational input combined with your extraordinary expertise and passion and compassion makes this one of our best dialogues we've had. And I have
Right.
to tell you that your feedback to the cinephiles and cinephobes was one of our most detailed and grained ones that we've had from our distinguished guests. So it shows your thoughtfulness, but also your amazing engagement with issues that are going to be shaping our planet for centuries to come. So I'm delighted that we have people like you, dare I say, a Durham graduate, at the cutting edge of these debates. And if these are in your hands, then I think we can breathe a bit easier about the future, irrespective of what Trump may or may not do. So we are really grateful to have you as our guest, Jemima, and hopefully we'll have you again because there is so much more I want to learn from you. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
very
Jemima.
much. That's very kind of you, and I was delighted to be a part of the BRI Dialogues.
Thank you.